welcome to all of you. May I invite, they are already there, Professor Abhijit Sen and Dr. Shenggen Fan to the dais. Friends, we have on the dais Stuart Gillespie, who is looking after the Tandi program. We have Professor Abhijit Sen and we have Dr. Shenggen Fan. Welcome to all of you for this side session on strengthening agriculture nutrition linkages in India. I only want to say right in the beginning that since we are required to follow the time limit because Prime Minister's inaugurate this function, we will follow a very strict time limit and we will have to finish this function by 12:15. Friends, this particular session is namely strengthening agriculture nutrition linkages in India, is jointly organized by Indian Economic Association and the Tandi group, tackling the agriculture nutrition disconnect in India together. We fortunate to have Professor Shenggen, Dr. Shenggen Fan, who is a Director General of IPRI. I need not introduce him. He has been there for several years. He has done extensive research work on public investment as its linkages with growth and poverty in Asia and Africa, beside, of course, the general issue of agriculture development. I welcome you, Dr. Fan, for this session and accept him to preside over. We have Abhijit Sen, who is a member Planning Commission and professor at Jawaharlal Nehru University. All of you know his work. He has worked on agriculture growth, but particularly growth, poverty linkages, and many other dimensions. Now he's involved on multiple aspects of agriculture development in Planning Commission, which is a body which decides the policy for agriculture sector as such. Well, this particular session, which is jointly organized, is going to really focus on how to strengthen agriculture nutrition linkages in India. This is based on the assumption that there is a disconnect between growth and nutrition, that while poverty has declined substantially, the various indicators of nutrition and malnutrition do not follow the suit. They lag behind the reduction in poverty, they lag behind the growth. And it is this disconnect which is the subject matter of this particular session. And in fact, the Tandi about which Stuart Gillespie will share with you is a group which addresses this particular disconnect as such. Well, with this few preliminary remarks, I now invite Abhijit Sen to say a few words. Thank you.
Welcome, everyone. And let me start by simply saying that I think how glad I am that this entire thing is happening. And the reason I'm glad is every now and then in India, we wake up to the fact that in terms of malnutrition, we are probably at the bottom of everyone's league. Having woken up, we often do certain things, and this is one of those periods in history where we are trying to do various things, amongst which is an effort to have a legal Food Security Act. But once you actually look at what the discussions going up to that act consist of, it is mainly one pillar, and that is access, to the detraction of the other two pillars, availability and absorption, which should make up anything to do with food security. Too much is being discussed at the moment in this context, which has to do with, can we give rights to people? Should we give it to everyone? Should we give it to some people? If we've got to give it to some people, how do we actually choose who those people are? Essentially, the access aspect has taken over. The availability absorption aspects have been put on the side. I hope that this set of meetings will at least help to turn the balance where it probably ought to belong. But as the background note to this particular session says, we know very little about the link between the main source of availability, which is agricultural and agricultural growth, and the outcomes on the nutrition side. But I think it does need to be put back onto the agenda, in part because one of the things we see in India is that somehow our deficit regions, parts of the country which don't actually produce a lot of food, seem to have, in many cases, better nutrition indicators. And similarly, there are time trends which will be pointed out. And there are also issues which keep coming up every now and then about, are we concentrating too much on calories and therefore on cereals? Should we be diversifying away from food grains into other types of crops? Now, there can be a lot of points of view here, and I'm sure it'll come up during the discussions. But even today, 2/3 of all energy comes from cereals. And that's a lot more when it comes to the poor. And we do tend to get into situations where we do seem to at least think we are running short of cereals, where, although the situation at the moment is we are building up huge amounts of stocks, thinking that that's the way of solving a future problem. There are management problems on the food side. There are production problems on the production side. And I hope at the end of this conference we'll be able to put those issues back on the table as compared to the access problems which is being addressed. Thanks a lot.
Dr. Sengin Fan, the Director General of IPRI.
Good morning, everybody. Well, let me welcome you first to join this consultation. The 2020 consultation involves the whole sorts of events. The conference is one of them. So this year, the 2020 conference has several innovations. So one of the innovations is the side events. So first time IPRI 2020 conference has side events. The second innovation is first time we will have knowledge fair. So you will see the knowledge fairs outside in the tent, so where we bring different stakeholders to show their knowledge products to engage dialogue. But this side event is focused on tackling malnutrition, tackling the distinction between agriculture and nutrition. We know that in the last several decades, the rapid agriculture growth has led to reduction in hunger and poverty. This is particularly true in India. So without rapid agriculture growth, without Green Revolution, this country or this continent would have much more poor people, hungry people. So the agriculture is a must, is necessary. But today we are still facing great challenges: hunger, malnutrition, poor health. And agriculture, in the meantime, is also facing challenges. So more volatile growing conditions because of climate change, and more scarce, probably scarcer resources like land and water. So how can we really link all these challenges together and convert that into opportunity? So agriculture growth obviously is important. How can we make agriculture growth also pro-nutrition or pro-health? So make sure that when we design agricultural growth strategy, when we design agricultural investment strategy, we have the nutrition health in our mind. So not simply just producing enough grains to fill our stomach. Well, of course, the growth, even the smart growth, we call it smart growth, is not sufficient. We need other interventions, direct nutrition interventions, to make sure that poor, particularly women and children, will have access to food, nutritious food, in short run. The IPRI study shows that a lack of good nutrition before 24 months could cause permanent damage to that person's life. So the combination or the comprehensive approach to use agriculture for achieving nutrition and health outcome. Meantime, this approach has to be supported by other interventions. And I really expect after this side event or even after this conference, some concrete actions can be taken. We can really move from dialogue to some actions, particularly policymakers, donors, practitioners. When they design certain policies, design certain investment, or design certain aid programs, or design certain practice, let's try to bring the three things together: agriculture, health, nutrition. So finally, I want to thank the organizers of this side event, Stuart, who else, Sanita, and others, Professor Thorat, the president of the Indian Economic Association, for bringing everybody here together. So I'm very surprised. This is one of the first events of this conference, and then this room is full. And for that, I thank you very much. I really hope you have a very active dialogue today.
Thank you very much, Shengen and Dr. Sen and Professor Thorat. I'm just going to say a few words just to very briefly set the context and say a little bit about what Tandy is. You've probably heard the word Tandy. You may not know what it means. And then I'll say just one or two sort of basic housekeeping comments. We should review quickly the agenda. We have a limited time here. We want to make the best use of that time and also maximize discussion. One of the basic motivations for our being here currently is the issue of the massive disconnect, significant disconnect between the rate of economic growth in India and the relative nutritional stagnation that we see. I used to work here 15 years ago. The situation with regard to underweight and stunting, the levels of underweight and stunting among young children has not changed greatly. We still see over 40% of under 3 kids in both those categories, underweight and stunting, in India based on the latest nationally representative data sets. Normally, globally and historically, we tend to see the rate of decline in underweight being around about half the rate of growth of per capita GDP. In India, we see that ratio has been 0.2, which means that the rate of nutritional improvement in this country is less than half of what you would expect given the growth rate. So there's this disconnect. TANDI stands for Tackling the Agricultural Nutrition Disconnect in India. Obviously, part of economic growth, a lesser part of economic growth, is being driven by agriculture, but we need to remember that well over 50% of the population derive their primary source of livelihood from agriculture, and clearly that percentage is greater for poorer groups. So we're trying to understand and shine a light on this disconnect. The TANDI initiative started, and we're grateful to support from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, facilitated by IFPRI. The aim of TANDI is twofold. We have a sort of basic content objective in the sense of shining a light on this disconnect. Where are the evidence for the linkages, the failure of linkages between agriculture and nutrition outcomes? And here we are involved and have been involved for the last year in actually working to synthesize various conceptual frameworks to get a common understanding between, on the one hand, economists, on the other, and they usually are on two hands, economists and nutritionists, to try and catalyze a process of bringing those two communities together to focus on what we believe is a common challenge and a massive common challenge of undernutrition in India. And The idea would be then, and we have been developing, generating hypotheses, using the conceptual framework, understanding the pathways, which Sunita will talk about shortly, to figure what we can say, what we know now, given the evidence of the interactions with papers that exist. We carried out a literature review wherein about 15 databases were searched, generating well over 4,000 citations. However, only around 70 of those were systematically looking at linkages between agriculture and nutrition, which we've used to develop a literature review which will be made public shortly. Other activities involve what we call quick win studies. We are working with Indian experts to actually carry out and commission papers shining light on some of these pathways, and in future there will be we'll be generating what we believe are the key knowledge gaps in terms of understanding, knowledge gaps in terms of what we need to know to improve the response. So I won't go much further into that at this stage. We are, as I say, short on time. Just to talk a little bit about the agenda, we have 3 major sessions. We are shortly going to be moving into an introductory session where Sunita will talk about trends in nutrition and agriculture in India, looking at what we have, where we are at in terms of conceptualization, what we believe are some of the key pathways and the evidence that would relate to those pathways. Session 2 will then dig deeper, really, into some of those pathways and talk about evidence for linkages or disconnects along the chain between agriculture and nutrition. We're going to have a quick break, and it really will have to be a quick break, I'm afraid, just 10 or 15 minutes at 11:15. Coming back for the last session on responses, where obviously we're moving into more operational discussion. What exists, what are the potentials, what are the obstacles in turning some of this evidence into better action? And we have a panel for that final session. The idea is generally to have the presentations 10 or 12-minute presentations, followed by the substantive period for discussion after each of the blocks of presentations. There is a couple of other things I want to, I think you've seen on the folders with the various briefs that have been put together extremely quickly in many cases, and we're really grateful to the authors for that. There are other longer, broader and more in-depth papers being developed, which will be made available to you in future. We will have a website where this will be placed. Finally, there's a sign-up sheet that's going around. Part of what we're doing is really to map stakeholders, develop links, improve connectivity, and, as I say, to bring these 2 communities of practice, or 2 disciplines of economics and nutrition, a bit closer together. So the sign-up sheet is important for us to know who's in the room as well to do that. But at this point, I'd like to introduce Sunita. Sunita Kadiala is a research fellow with the Poverty, Health and Nutrition Division based here of IFPRI, based here in New Delhi. She will talk about trends and the conceptual pathways between agriculture and nutrition. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. It's nice to see a full room. Many people told me that it is a bad idea to have anything start at 8:30. Considering I almost didn't make it, I'm really happy to see all of you here this morning. Yeah. I did press one. Sorry. Okay. So as Stuart said, I'm going to talk briefly about nutrition and agriculture trends in India and some of the pathways that we have been grappling with many of you in the room and also some people who are not in this room. So before I proceed any further, I would like to acknowledge many people who have contributed either directly to this presentation or to the thinking behind this presentation over the last few months. So the question that we are all faced with today, and indeed for the rest of the conference, is how does agriculture development and policy influence nutrition outcomes in India? As I was really grappling with how to frame my talk, one of my friends and colleagues came in Purnima here, and she said, well, why don't I use the framework of thinking that one of the prominent people in the last decade who has emerged, unfortunately for us, has put forward. So according to this person, apparently there are some known knowns. These are the things that we know. And then there are some known unknowns. That is to say that there are some things that we do not know. And finally, this gentleman thought that there are also some unknown unknowns, that once we don't know that we don't know. So for once in my life, I'm going to use the Rummy framework a little bit and start my talk. So now, first I will present some of the known knowns that we all agree on and have a good understanding about, which is the development indicators in India and the trends, and move on to the conceptual frameworks and pathways. And then very briefly, because the other presenters will present more elaborately, but I will just illustrate some of these pathways and how they have played out in India. And then I end with the known unknowns, which is some of the lingering questions and some points. Since I don't know what I don't know, I'll just leave that one out. So we all agree that India now is on a more sustained and rapid economic growth trajectory. And poverty rates as poverty defined by the Indian government has declined steadily. And the overall GDP, share of agriculture GDP with respect to the overall GDP has declined, but it is somewhat to be expected in a growing economy like India. But what is worrisome is that agriculture sector performance is below the target growth rates of approximately 4% in the last decade and a half. India, as the previous speakers have mentioned already, is on the bottom of the pile of any possible indicator we can think of, which is the Human Development Index. We are, again, on the bottom of the pile, so in the Gender Gap Index and in the Global Hunger Index, just to name a few. And the same is the story with the lack of appreciable improvements in nutrition rates of both child and adult improvements in reductions in undernutrition. Now, of course, these are the national trends, and we have to appreciate that India is a big country with a lot of variability. Some of these can be some small nations around the world, and there are considerable variations in progress by state and by social groups. Just to illustrate this point, work by Professor Thorat and Nidhi Sadhana show that scheduled castes and scheduled tribes are more likely to engage in agriculture, have lower farm wage rates, and have higher rates of child and adult undernutrition than people from other castes. But the interstate variations point to a much more complicated picture. If you look at this, just a simple 2x2 table with changes in agriculture performance between 1992 and 2005 on one side, with improvements or lack of it in stunting, you look at some positive and negative outliers. I just like to point out to, say, for example, Gujarat or Andhra Pradesh, that had decent progress in agriculture, but really not much improvements in undernutrition. So yes, some states have a disconnect between agriculture and nutrition, and some not others, and others in a more positive direction. So in order to really understand what are some of these factors that are playing into what is happening within these groups or within the states and across the nation, we really need to understand what nutrition is. And as Professor Abhijit Sen already pointed out, we all mean different things by nutrition. For some people, it is just the mere absence of hunger. For some people, it's having certain amount of grains. For some people, like us, we want to see changes in anthropometry and improvements in micronutrient status. So if we agree that those biological and physiological outcomes are indeed important, then this is a framework that is quite commonly used among public health and nutrition groups, which really helps to bring various disciplines together to think through how many of us can come together to contribute to one common outcome, which is improvements in child nutrition status. So if you look at the orangish yellow box there, the first one really alludes to the food intake, the consumption of food, and health aspects, which are commonly referred to as the immediate causes of child nutrition status. So the interaction between them will determine child nutrition status, which in turn is determined by a host of underlying causes of undernutrition, which refers to access to food, maternal characteristics and conditions, childcare practices, access to clean and safe drinking water, sanitation, health, and so on and so forth, which in turn, again, are determined by how a society is organized, wages, institutional and political arrangements, so on and so forth. These are commonly referred to as basic causes of undernutrition. Now, if you look at the intervention side, there are certain direct interventions, such as improving food consumption patterns and improving micronutrient status, breastfeeding practices, that can impact immediate causes of undernutrition. But the science also tells us that even if these interventions are scaled up at a coverage and have effective coverage rates, even then we can reduce undernutrition only by 1/3. So we need to grapple with the idea of addressing underlying causes of nutrition. And this diagram, although it takes a long time to explain, it clearly points out to the role of agriculture and how it cuts across all the underlying causes of child nutrition and so the adult nutrition. So over the last few months, when we started Tandi, we have entered into discussions facilitated by IFPRI. Many of us in this room, and again, who are also not in this room, have discussed at length about what are some of the specific causal pathways, or how can we conceptualize some of these pathways on how agriculture can improve improve underlying causes of undernutrition or the nutrition status. And we thought there are about 7 have been elaborated, and I like to believe that we have some consensus around this. And I will go through them very briefly. So agriculture clearly is a source of food. It determines the wide range of household, the food basket that one has and are able to afford. It is a clear driver of poverty reduction. And agriculture policy and food price policy all determine the ability of households and individuals to access various range of food groups, but also the non-food the non-food aspects of determinants of nutrition, which is healthcare and other factors I just elaborated. India is a country where 70% of the population, rural population, is still dependent mainly on agriculture, and 83% of the women labor force in rural areas are engaged in agriculture. So agriculture continues to be a very, very important aspect of the livelihoods, and therefore it has important implications for gender dimensions. Agriculture can influence women's status and therefore intra-household decisions and resource allocations, and women's ability to manage young child care, and women's own nutrition status, which is important also in its own right, but also for child undernutrition and intergenerational transmission of undernutrition and poverty. Many of these will be elaborated by the speakers that will come after me, so I'm not going to elaborate on all those now. Now, that looks very complicated, but actually it's not. The idea is, how do you take each of these causal pathways and how do you really empirically investigate some of these pathways? What this tells you is, actually Stuart has 7 of these, mind you. I'm sparing you and I have only 1 here. But what that tells you is all the yellow boxes show you the causal chain and help us think through what are the variables that should go into an empirical estimation. So we have all these nice frameworks and causal pathways, but what does that mean in the Indian context? So some Menon et al. And with many other colleagues inside and outside of IFPRI have really looked at how the data is playing out with respect to what we know globally are the determinants of undernutrition. And from there to really think through what are the entry points for agriculture. In the context of India, using NFHS3 data, these investigators find that clearly dietary diversity is a very, very important determinant of child undernutrition. And we know that agriculture is an entry point for improving the food baskets, at least at the household level. And poverty continues to be an important determinant of undernutrition. And so is maternal nutrition, and a host of factors related to women and how they enter motherhood continue to be important. And we know that these can be the 4 key entry points for agriculture. And what this tells you is that the data from India supports the frameworks as well. So I have 3 slides basically trying to outline some of these, how these entry points are playing out in India historically and also more currently. Now, this is a slide that many of you have seen before from various publications, but I really like the way the World Bank people have done this, so I decided to reuse it. So what this tells you is some of the pathways in which agriculture has historically actually contributed to nutrition, underlying causes of nutrition in India. It has reduced, in the heyday of Green Revolution, it has reduced poverty rates drastically both in urban and rural areas, increased the production of certain cereal crops, mostly wheat and rice, and reduced the real prices, giving access to the very important source of calories to a wide range of sections of the population, making large-scale famines rather rare in this country. And we have another heartening example in the milk revolution and by Dr. Kurian and his colleagues who have, they are arguably different models, but these are heartening examples. But Green Revolution, what also has done is displace some of the micronutrient-rich crops, therefore causing some permanent or at least long-term shifts, downward shifts in consumption of micronutrient-rich foods. The point is to say that there is a role for agriculture, and there is a reason to strengthen some of these linkages further. Preliminary analyses by my colleagues sitting here, Derek Hady, Alice Chu, and others, have shown that agriculture growth has some tenuous relationship with child undernutrition, if you look at the agriculture GDP per worker. But it is somewhat stronger when it comes to our maternal nutrition. And as we discussed, is important in its own right, but also in terms of for child nutrition. Amresh Dubey in the next presentation is going to talk at length about food consumption patterns. But I think many of you in the room are quite aware of the literature in India about the sweeping consumption changes that have been happening. Many of these are due to, of course, raising incomes, changes in preferences, but also some of these have direct links with agriculture policy and technology. So I'll leave you now with some discussion points. At the national level, it may appear that actually there is no disconnect. Weak agriculture growth and not such stellar improvements in nutrition rates. But when you dig down deeper, there are several variations at the state level. Stuart mentioned that we did one of my colleagues, Jody Harris, has done phenomenal reviews and bibliographic searches on 15 databases and found about 71 studies that rather address partially some of the pathways with varying degrees of rigor. And so we find that there is a huge conceptual gap in really looking at these in a systematic fashion, these links, but is also being driven to some extent by the data disconnect. There is a paucity of unit level data which brings the various variables that we need to track these linkages over a period of time and how this is playing out in the short and long run. And I think this is a gap that we need to address sooner than later. So my presentation and I would say the body of Tandi's work has shown that empirical analyses broadly support the framework and the proposed pathways. And then we identified some important entry points for agriculture, which the following speakers will talk about. So I don't mind if you keep all your tough questions to them and leave me. Thank you.